Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about a very important topic. We've had over 30 female founders on the Pitch Please podcast talking about their founder story. But one of the elephants in the room is really talking about investing in women and talking about strategies to help female founders thrive, some of the challenges they face, but then some of the opportunities and resources they should be thinking about. To talk about this today, I brought on Landon, an expert in this space. But before we go any further, I think what's really important is to learn a little bit about you, Landon, and maybe give us a bit of background on why you're so passionate about this topic. Welcome to the show.
Mike, thanks so much for having me. I'm Landon Steele. I am a chemical engineer by training. So I started my career in a male-dominated field. I specialized in biotech, moved to after graduating from Waterloo, moved to California, worked in a big global biotech for 20 odd years, and then took a left turn and co-founded my own healthcare company. And we grew that up to be California wide over another 10 years or so, and then sold it. And, over that time, having been a female founder, having worked in male dominated industries, I was just really interested in the challenges of being a female founder. And since selling my company, I've become a consultant and I work with startups of all stripes, both in Canada and the US. But I just have a particular interest in female founders. And so I really am so glad you're willing to welcome me onto your podcast today. And let's talk about resources for female founders.
So maybe let's start with probably one of the meatiest dialogues, which is the navigation of funding. And so I think oftentimes I've read and seen, and many others have seen, stats or comments about disparities in funding for female founders. Can you give us an overview of maybe what you're seeing and some of the things that maybe are behind that?
Sure. Well, it's really interesting because there's a bit of cognitive dissonance going on. There's like two major pieces of research data out there. One that has been highlighted again and again is actually that women-led companies are more successful on a variety of metrics. So even in a recent Harvard study showed that companies with more women in senior positions are more profitable, more socially responsible. They provide a better customer experience. Like, who wouldn't want that as an investor, right? But on the other hand, the other statistic that seems to plague the startup ecosystem is that only 2% of VC funding goes to companies that are female founded. It's not 40%, it's not 30%, it's 2% of the dollars that go there. And that's a pretty stark statistic. Now, so people in the startup ecosystem, that got everybody's attention, needless to say. And so I think that's why you're seeing more and more resources out there to try to close that gap.
So maybe I actually want to learn a little bit more about the first part there, where you talked about, are more profitable, are more successful. What do you think are some of the key drivers that make that true?
Right. Well, there's a number of reasons, but I think, again, it's I guess it's a heuristic that, to be taken seriously, a lot of women have to show up twice as prepared and work twice as hard, right? And so I think that naturally, because the women that tend to be running successful companies have been prepared and have been working hard for a long time, and they do very well. They just bring, and they also come with a different worldview, and so they think differently. They can be collaborative. They can, I think it's well established in general also that companies with more diverse teams, right, they're not blindsided by things. If they've got different opinions and they're willing to work through hearing those different opinions to find the best solution, they have also been shown in study after study to be more successful. So I think it's just an aspect of that.
Makes sense. So it is an area definitely worth investing in. So now I want to address that second piece you talked about, which is the 2%. But I want to understand a little bit more, like, is this a cause? Is it an effect? Is it truly people, holding back money and not investing because they're female founders? Is it their exposure to opportunities, or is it something else? Do you have any thoughts on like where or why we're seeing this trend happen?
Sure. And as with most things, I don't think there's one simple answer, right? It's a nuanced answer. And if you talk to a bunch of people, you're going to get a bunch of different opinions. But I'll try to summarize at least what I've heard, what I've read, and some of what has been my own experience. So there's a pitched book study, and we can link to it in the show notes, that has this shocking graph of only 2% of VC funded dollars going to female-led companies. Now, again, that 2% is for companies where the entire founding team is female. So if you zoom out a little bit, to just companies where there's a female founder and maybe some male founders, it goes up closer to 20%. So
Okay.
not quite as shocking, still not parity, but some encouragement there.
It is useful background though to know that it's maybe not as starkly dramatic as the 2%, but still obviously some gaps to go work through.
I think the other thing I do really want to emphasize is, VC funding and VC fundable companies are a very narrow segment of the economy. You know that. Your listeners should know that after listening to your podcast for this long. It's only a very narrow kind of company that's appropriate for VC funding. So I also just want to be really clear that this doesn't mean that women aren't founding businesses, small businesses, large businesses, and thriving in a whole bunch of other sectors. I'm really just narrowing in on the, frankly, male-dominated VC sector where it is still a bit of a struggle. So what can we do? I mean, I think pattern recognition holds us back a little bit. I mean, the whole VC ecosystem is around pattern recognition, right? They're looking for the data and the metrics that prior successful companies had, and they're using that as a filter for future successful companies. That makes perfect sense, right? And I think that should be, but I think we all just need to be conscious that sometimes that brings in some unconscious bias. Another thing to be aware of is only 17% of the decision makers at VC funds greater than $50 million are women. So again, that's still less than 1 in 5. They're there, but but I think if we can get a more diverse set of investors, again, they'll relate to a wider number of companies. I mean, it's natural, again, that anybody who's been on the investor side of the table, they relate to companies that they relate to, right? And in a pitch, you have to, get that emotional connection or get them to get it really quickly. And so the more, if you're a female founder, and especially if you're pitching a company where the customers are women, it's understandable that you might have a better chance, with investors that are relating very quickly and immediately and with all the shortcuts to what you're selling. You know what I mean? And it's harder to sell to people that really don't relate to your company at all. That's just logical. That's not terrible. It just means, there's an opportunity for more people on the investor side of the table too.
There's so many things that I want to unpack because I think it's important, but maybe the first and most critical is helping people understand this notion where, to your point, maybe it's not that females aren't building companies. It's also maybe not that females aren't getting funding. There might still be disparity in some of those other areas, but some of the starkness of this statistic are around VC backed. And so you did talk about some elements about VC backed and some challenges and opportunity areas on the VC backed side of the house. But I think what's important to talk about is what is and isn't in scope for VC backed, because I think one of the things that I've seen across many of the interviews we've done on the podcast is the challenge of getting VC-backed money is not actually just a female challenge. It actually has a lot to do with total addressable market and the problem you're solving. Now, that might be grounded in people solving different types of problems, and maybe that's part of the issue. And I don't want to call it an issue, but maybe it's part of the dialogue that maybe gets overlooked. Can you talk a little bit about what you see is or isn't VC backable?
Sure. And I think that's a great point, because I tend to work with early stage founders, and a lot of the resources and the incubators and the accelerators I'll talk about later, they also tend to work with that early stage founder, not the Series B founder, right? There it becomes a little bit more about, your metrics. But in those early stages, when you don't have a lot of metrics, a lot of investment decisions are made based on believing in you, believing in the person, believing in the size of the business. So to your point, a lot of very early founders don't get VC math yet. And I think that's a really critical education challenge for all founders, not just female founders, to really understand. Don't waste your time unless you're pitching a business that really could be a unicorn, that can have a multi-billion-dollar valuation, that has, a tens of billion-dollar market. If you're coming in pitching anything smaller than that to a full-fledged VC, you're not going to get terribly far, whether you're male or female or Martian, right? So, yeah. So that's the first thing to understand. But then after you've got that behind you, and again, it can even be big, but you've got to be looking for this VC rocket ship, like this super fast growth, growth at any cost, and that you believe that only through that mechanism will you be successful and stay ahead of your competitors. So again, not every business fits that, and many really, really don't and shouldn't. And so again, but putting all that aside and sticking with the VC fundable businesses, again, I think there's two challenges. One, if you're a female founder, and I work with a lot of them that specialize in things like women's health, where there's huge markets, billions of dollars, massive opportunity, an unmet need, and yet, if they walk into a room full of male investors, the male investors, their eyes kind of glaze over a little bit. And I've watched this happen because they don't relate. So again, I think that's normal, right? And so that's on that side. I think a solution is to have more diverse investor population and more options for pitching to people that will relate to your product. But you also see women coming in and pitching an enterprise SaaS business, a business that should be gender neutral, that's got big numbers, that has been heavily invested in by VCs before, plenty of unicorn exits. And that's where I think there's still there can be a challenge with unconscious bias. I mean, again, studies have been done that show that investors and even female investors fall into the same trap. They tend to ask male investors more about the future of their business, the upside potential of their business, and they tend to ask female founders more about the risk and the downside, and how are they going to manage either the risk, or how are they going to manage it with all their other responsibilities? Kind of questions that you wouldn't really ask a male founder. So again, I think it's incumbent on all of us who are on the investor side to try to check our own biases in the questioning, maybe be more prepared with questions, and make sure that we're asking equally tough ones to both founders.
I like that you've kind of shared a couple of those solutions, but I do have, some faith in it sounding like, at least in things that are not just VC backed, there's some opportunity there, and some could be broken down as the types of businesses that are approaching VC funding. And the reality is VC funding is not for everybody. So there are some biases and some challenges, males and females in those decision-making processes own. around getting better at that. But to your point, there's other funding mechanisms, and it sounds like maybe in some of those other things that are not just VC backed, there might be slightly better representation and slightly better economics, but still work to do.
Absolutely.
Right now we're talking just about funding, right? And funding is one big piece, but sometimes, it's funny because we've talked about this on the show, funding is not the only measure of success, and it is probably, while it helps you keep the lights on and hire more people and move faster, it is not the sole thing needed to make a startup successful.
Absolutely.
Outside of funding, where else do you maybe see or not see this opportunity or issue arising?
I agree with you 100%. I think the the funding rounds have acquired a bit of celebrity status, and everybody promotes this funding round, that funding round. They are just a means to an end. They're not the goal themselves, right? But they are a little bit of a validation that the market sees potential in what you're doing. And for many businesses, it just takes some capital to build them. So they're a necessity. Again, I think I'm a huge fan of bootstrapped businesses, and I give that advice all the time. If you can find non-dilutive funding, absolutely non-dilutive funding.
It's way more common in Canada, right? I think we see a lot more of the Canadian funding layers. Maybe aren't as much of the race to the B, C, D, and to be debated whether it's our ambitions or the size of business or the funding market itself. But we do see a lot more seed or bootstrapped, different type of investment models that aren't purely this VC-backed model in Canada. Sorry to interrupt. I think it's an important observation that I think I've seen talking to nearly 100 startups here in the Canadian ecosystem, and why it's so important to talk about these other elements.
It's very true. And you work in AI. And so, even in Silicon Valley, which is where I spent most of my career, they're talking a lot about how AI is going to enable, smaller teams with much less money to go way farther than they used to have to. So again, I think a lot of things are shifting, no doubt. Again, I think where it comes down to is whether it's pitching to VCs or whether it's, other aspects of running a company. There's so many resources available. Again, there can still be some societal biases that women are used to dealing with, but at the end of the day, what really helps you is education, is helping you to know, what's expected. Whether you're applying for a non-dilutive funding grant, or whether you're pitching to VCs, or going for a bank loan, or just trying to hire people, right? It's all communication, and I think there are so many. What's great is there's so many resources now that people can tap into to realize how to tell their story in the most convincing way to achieve their goals, whatever they may be, even beyond just getting a VC check.
So maybe that's actually a good part of this to start to change from where are the challenges, what's the lay of the land, to what can we do, where are there opportunities. Maybe a good place to start would be what is available that people may not know about, or how can we start to, instill this change, if you will?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the main one that I think has become very different is just the fact that startups don't go it alone as much as they used to in the past. We are all so much more connected, and I think in particular in the startup world, because there are so many accelerators and incubators and chances for founders to interact with other founders, I think that's a really different dynamic, and one that I really encourage every founder to take advantage of. Don't just sit in your own basement coding away at what you think is going to be the next big thing. Get out there and talk to other people, meet other founders. You'll be amazed at the resources that are offered to you. When I
Why do you
talked
find, yeah,
recently.
like why do you find that so valuable? I think I've heard it said a few times, and it's really good that you bring it up, but I don't know if everyone understands the why it's so valuable, right? Like the
Right.
why incubators work, why immersing yourself in the ecosystem works, and why that might be a means to help solve and inspire some additional energy in the space. What are you seeing?
Well, again, I think a lot of founders become very wrapped up in their idea. They become very wrapped up in the product, developing the product. Um, they say, the heuristic is, first time founders focus on product and second time founders focus on distribution, right? And I think after you've been in this space for as long as I have, you realize that even a great product isn't a guarantee for success, right? So it's about getting people to buy it. It's about those connections. It's about introductions. It's about um, doing better customer discovery to make sure you're building a product that people not only want but will pay for. You did a good episode on product market fit, right? Finding product market fit is a real challenge. And again, when you're just wrapped up in your own idea, you I think one of the key learnings that most first-time founders don't understand is they need to be spending a whole lot more time out there talking to people about their idea, right? The instinct is to be secretive and not tell anybody, but you
Stealth
need to
mode.
be testing your idea and getting data as quickly as possible about whether this has got legs, whether this is going to work. And again, what I think is really valuable, and I was in the Bay Area when Y Combinator got started. They became this juggernaut of building a network, a powerful network of both peer-to-peer relationships amongst new founders, but bringing in powerful mentors that could help them avoid mistakes, that could open doors for them, this and that. I think that having that group and that network has made a huge difference. And now it's great to see that that's not just a Silicon Valley thing. They're all over Canada. They're all over, other incubators and accelerators are all over the world, and they're a super resource. I wouldn't consider starting a company without going through one of those today.
So in those incubators, or maybe just broadly in the things you're seeing, what do you maybe see versus maybe omit to see in some of the most successful female-led startups around the world?
Well, again, I, I, I think one of the trends that you're seeing in some of the more successful startups these days is back to the same word, community, right? They're leading and building a community, not just a product. And I think that's key. Again, whether it's a male founder or female founder, that's a big shift in trend. And starting to develop that community even sooner in your business. I guess what a lot of founders have done is develop something great and then said to the world, hello world, here's my something great. And they get crickets because nobody knows about them. They haven't been building themselves up as thought leaders in the area. Nobody's following them. You know this, right? Social media has changed all of that. And you can be building that following even while you're building your product, such that when you're ready to launch, you've got a ready early audience of people that can be ambassadors for your product and help you get to the next level. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but I think when you when you take advantage of some of these educational resources, whether they're just online or whether they're part of these communities, you can learn some of these tricks that will save you time, that will save you effort, that will put you on a better path to success. There's still no guarantees. There's still a lot of luck involved. There's still a lot of grind involved. But if you can be spared some naive, mistakes that could cost you months of time, it's well worth it.
Are there some of these communities or networks that you're seeing that might be valuable resources for female founders or founders alike? I think one of the ones that you kind of grouped or categorized was obviously incubators, and that's a one that lots of people obviously may or may not know about as a founder. Like you sort of at least hear about that in the space. But what are some of the other communities or resources that founders should be exploring, especially for female founders?
Sure. The good news is there's a lot of them. So it can be as simple as just forming a group chat with 4 or 5 other peers. Even that's a huge resource. I'm on the board of an organization called the Canadian Women's Network. It was started by a bunch of Canadian expats down in Silicon Valley, and our goal was to try to build bridges between Canadian female founders in particular and help them get Silicon Valley ready. So a lot of that is education, but it's also bringing them down to San Francisco for a few days of panels and mentorship and networking and pitching to really see how it's done in the States. Again, it's a high bar. It's not necessarily for everybody, but since so many Canadian companies have an aspiration to expand into the States, again, you should be starting to build those networks earlier rather than later. So we host a program called Pathway to Silicon Valley twice a year. The next one's coming up in November 19th and 20th in San Francisco. And so that I would really encourage, female founders who are at a point where they're not fundraising yet, but they're starting to think about it, or they're not expanding to the US yet, but they want to know what's involved. That's a great time to go. Another one
for that one, actually, Landon, just so people kind of start jotting the note down right now. What's involved in that? Some people might very quickly dismiss themselves from being eligible or thinking that that's for them.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if we're addressing the female founding topic head on, I want to make sure that we very clearly articulate who it is or isn't for, so people can very quickly determine if they should follow up. Who is that type of a visit to Silicon Valley for with this upcoming November event?
Right. Well, I will say again, it is for tech companies. It is for companies that have aspirations to be VC fundable or are already early, have some early funding, but that are still a little bit earlier on in their journey. Let's say $1 million to 10 million revenue.
Got it.
And want to lay the foundation for leveling up in the not too distant future. So it's educational, but it's also introductions. It's also meeting with people, and we're in the process of planning it, and there should be an Angel Summit affiliated with it. And another thing we are looking into is there's a new movie called Show Her the Money that's come out recently. Now that's aimed also very much at female funders and female founders. And it's a new documentary, and the way they are launching it is through watch parties. So I'm currently involved in organizing a couple of those, one here in Vancouver where I live now, and one in the Bay Area where I was for 30 years. So again, that just sort of highlights some of these female founders, what their journey's like. It highlights some of the great female funders out there. So I think it's a great watch for any Canadian female founder that just wants to learn more about the ecosystem. And so I would encourage people to participate in a watch party, either one of the ones I'm organizing or one of the ones they can see on their website.
That's awesome. And I'm sure that's one of those things that we can also link in the show notes, since it sounds like those might be coming up and people might be interested. But for the visit down to San Fran, it sounds like that is for people that are currently revenue driving. So if you're seed, pre-seed, still an MVP, maybe still a bit early, although some seed companies are north of that 1 million ARR type number that we're talking about. So it still might be for you. But if you're more in the early stage, still working through your MVP, maybe one of these watch parties and the communities that surround it start to become one of the first things you can go do to take action pretty quickly. Are there other communities or resources that you think we should be kind of highlighting for people listening?
Sure. So I'm in Vancouver now, so I'll highlight a couple that are here, but I can highlight some others that are in different parts of the country. There's a group here called Spring Impact Capital, and I think they do a fantastic job of they focus on social impact investing themselves, but they do a fantastic job on education. They have a whole online program actually called Right Fit Capital, and it's accessible on their website. And that's to help you learn, what are the options? Am I VC fundable? If I'm not, what are the options? So I think that's a super resource for female founders. They have another program that's specifically for Black female founders. So again, it's great to see them going even more niche. And finally, one that I'm excited about is called the Women-Led Impact Investor Challenge. The next one will start in early 2025, so the applications will be coming up by the end of this year. But it's an 8-week program for early stage startups and early angel investors, people that want to learn how to be angel investors. And over that 8 weeks, the startup learns how to pitch and gets lots of feedback, and the angel investors learn what to look for. And so there's education on both sides. And so again, whether you're a woman interested in learning about angel investing or you're somebody interested in pitching, it's a great opportunity. So those are a couple here. Another one that's for female investors is called the Women's Equity Lab. Again, trying to bring more diversity to the investor side of the table. And they don't preferentially invest in male or female companies. They just look for the best companies and the best founders. But again, it's more trying to teach women how to become early investors. So I think that's another great resource. And it just happens that at this point, 76% of their investments are in women-led companies, but that's not a filter, but it's working out that way. Anyway, I'll stop there. Do you have any questions? Because I could keep going.
There's a question that I had because I think you brought up a very interesting point. I think a lot of the networks you're sharing, I'm curious if, and maybe there's two parts to this dialogue, are those primarily for female founders? Should male founders be considering them as well? Maybe those forums are exclusively for female founders, but there's others that are for everyone. And what is the ticket to entry for many of those? Is it for everyone, sure, or does it lean one way or the other? And what are the pros and cons of, because I think there's the balance, right? There's definitely forums and networks where there's probably value of things to be discussed in maybe a safe space. But then if you isolate too much, you create polarization and you actually don't tackle the problem. Like, I think what's cool about today and some of the dialogues you and I have had leading up to today's show, we just had open conversation about it. And both of us are learning different things, where to lean in, where not to lean in, but it's only possible when everyone's at the table. What are your thoughts and like what you're seeing, and how does it kind of translate to some of those ones you're mentioning? And are there others people could both get involved in?
I think that's an excellent point. I think I agree completely. I think there's a role for sort of female-focused communities as an early entry point. It might feel more comfortable, and they can provide maybe more targeted, specific education. However, I think it's a huge mistake to stay only in those communities. They play a vital role, a critical role, but ultimately the goal is to be out there, with everybody else. It should not be two distinct communities. It shouldn't be like 20 different distinct communities for each person's identity. We should be trying to make sure that the community accepts and is welcoming of all different members. So 100%. Some of the ones I mentioned already might be a little bit female focused, but most accelerators are not limited to just female participants. And I think they're extremely valuable for female founders to be part of. So if I were to go quickly, like to name a few across the country, There's the Accelerator Center in Waterloo. There's Communitech in Waterloo. There's Creative Destruction Lab. They've got outposts in Toronto, in the Rockies, in Vancouver. There's Volta in Halifax that serves the maritime community. So none of these are focused in just on women, but they all provide mentorship. And the founders can kind of pick and choose, in many cases, the mentors they need, depending on where they are in their journey and what their burning issue of the day is. So again, you can tailor your own mentorship experience based on where you are and what your needs are, but you don't have to be in a whole separate group. So I think those all offer phenomenal education and connections and networking, and they'll help open doors for you.
Yeah, and I like your kind of focus on the participation in both. So whether you're a male founder or a female founder, don't just isolate yourself to one part of the conversation.
Absolutely.
You actually owe it to yourselves and others like you trying to thrive and succeed. If you, to your point, only go to female forums and that collective group of female founders never joins things that are cross-pollinating, the females that do attend those are going to feel even more in isolation. So it's on both sides to really bring this conversation together, even though there are some points when the conversations, need to create those spaces that maybe help, create the initial entry point for people. We've talked a lot about a ton of great resources, ways to sort of tackle this problem head on. I'm thankful that, the 2% number, while stark, isn't the harshest of the realities. It does sound like there's some work to do, but once we unpacked it, it does sound like we are making some progress, which is great. Are there any other thoughts or resources you think, either for male listeners in the audience or female listeners or founders alike?
Well, again, I think really it all boils down to four things, and all of us can think about it and challenge ourselves to do a little bit better at it. Let's, create environments that are as welcoming as possible to female founders and other underrepresented founders. So that can be as simple as, a lot of networking or meetups happen in the early evenings, right? Maybe that time doesn't work great for everybody. Maybe try having some different options for meetup times, right? And see who shows up at the different ones. You might be surprised. We can create programs that help educate women about the tech startup expectations so that when they do show up to pitch, they're prepared, and they know that they're a fit. Because again, if people show up trying to pitch for VC funding, but they're not VC fundable, they're not going to get the funding. So let's make sure we're investing in educational programs like that. Let's make the investor pool more diverse. Like I told you, it's natural that people relate to companies and want to invest in companies that they relate to, that they immediately get how huge the problem is. So we need a few more women writing checks, but we're working on that. And the last thing is, just watch yourself and watch others for letting unconscious bias sink into your questioning or how you interact with female founders. And I think if we can all do a better job of gently calling each other out when we see that, it is unconscious bias. It really is, and women have it too. Everyone has unconscious biases. But again, I think the more people recognize that happens, the more they can change it. It's not that difficult.
Great advice. I love that we started the episode with specifically talking around investing in women. And as we kind of come to wrap this up, it's actually about all underrepresented groups and not just about the funding. It's about how we lean into the conversations, how we lean into the network and the other resources outside of the money. So it's not an investment from a financial perspective only, but an investment of time, energy, and effort from all parties. and not just for women. So I love kind of the way we put a bow around that. Landon, this has been an amazing dialogue. I'm excited to make sure that we get those resources in the show notes for everyone. Lots of hyperlinks probably in this one, some actions
Absolutely.
that may be even more time relevant. So if you are interested in joining some of those watch parties or the trip down to the Bay Area, I think we'll make sure those are linked, and you should jump on that right away because I imagine there is a limited number of seats. But Landon, thank you so much for coming to talk about this very important topic, investing in women, strategies to help female founders thrive. And we've talked about some that are immediate, actionable, and some long-term for the entire ecosystem. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Mike. And I am so excited that you are trying to shine a spotlight on the Canadian tech ecosystem writ large. I think Canadians in general, are also not so great at tooting our own horn. And so I'm so glad to be part of your effort to try to make sure people see all the amazing stuff that's coming out of the Canadian tech ecosystem. Thanks again.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And thanks to everyone that tuned in for another episode of Pitch Please.